Welcome to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the PulpNet, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines for over 25 years. Online at thepulp.net. In this Pulp Event podcast, Henry G. Franke discusses the amazing, thrilling, and fantastic Edgar Rice Burroughs. Henry is the editor of the Burroughs Bulletin. His presentation was part of ERBfest, held in conjunction with PulpFest. This event was recorded on Thursday, August 19, 2021, at PulpFest 2021 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Edgar Rice Burroughs, as many of y'all recall, started writing when he was 35. He was born in 1st of September, 1875. So he was along in age by the time he started writing, first started putting pen to paper for Under the Moons of Mars in 1911. So you can chop his periods of his life up in certain bits, professional and personal. Big one, of course, when he moved out to California and bought what became the Tarzana Ranch in 1919. But as the years progressed and he continued writing, he also tried his hands at business on the side. And in many ways, those ensured a lot of trials and tribulations for him. He actually put 200 acres and his own main house to the Cabaret Country Club. That thing basically went under. Took a long time. He was actually not living there for many years. Got there a little bit and then sold the house again. He started Burroughs Tarzan Enterprise, Burroughs Tarzan Pictures. Actually did a couple of Tarzan movies and some other non-Tarzan films with Ashton Deerholt, who at the time was married to Florence Gilbert. Those fell through. He started something called the Apache Motor Company for airplane motors. That fell through. He bought some interest in a local airport. That fell through. In other words, he just didn't realize he probably was best off sticking with writing and selling his trademarks and copyrights. Great Depression certainly didn't help him or anyone else, and that was still lingering in the period we're talking about here. And of course, presage of World War II, both in the Far East and in Europe, were beginning in this period. All right, his wife of 35 of many years, Emma Burroughs, had problems. He decided to divorce her, and that divorce came through in December 34. He wound up marrying Florence Gilbert Deerholt, the former wife of his business partner, in April of 1935. They actually honeymooned in Hawaii, and that probably gave him an idea about later on moving to Hawaii in 1940. He also, by the way, adopts her two young children. He really cares a lot about them, especially the daughter, Carol Lee. His writing career, just to point out, he always knew his market had certain limitations. He couldn't break into the slicks. So he was truly a pulp writer by default, and even then, certain editors only wanted certain kinds of stories, not others. Tarzan obviously was the big push, and he got tired of doing Tarzan pretty early on, but he understood where the biggest pull was for editors and readership. But as the story started being a little repetitive and maybe kind of lacked some of the luster of the early ones, rejection started increasing over those years in the 30s and into the 40s. He also decided, because he was always worried about not getting the most out of his work, he decided to publish his own books under the Burroughs imprint starting in 1931 with, as you see here, Tarzan the Invincible. Interestingly, one of his editors, when he was discussing this idea about how his fiction was selling, said, the thing is, your fiction's getting kind of repetitive. The readers have seen it. They're getting more excited about what they see in the movies and the newspaper strips. So, ironically, his own incomes from other media were potentially biting into his readership of his own fiction. World War II officially starts 1 September 1939 when Germany invades Poland. That was 64th birthday of Burroughs. All right, why does he move to Hawaii and leave Southern California? Income started really dropping off because of various sales, especially overseas sales dropping because of the war. He's paying for 2 households. He's taking care of Emma, and he actually was paying her something of a salary as a copy editor for a while. Meanwhile, he has a young wife. When he got married, he was 59 and she was 30. He kept trying to keep up. He worn himself out. But the big problem actually was income versus outlay. So Hawaii was about, in his mind, about a third the cost of living in California. So they decided to go to California. He arrives in April of 1940, just after his family. It's important to understand that Burroughs is a true celebrity about this time. As you see here, even when his wife and his wife's children come to Hawaii, that's big news. Him and his wife honeymooning in Hawaii is big news, at least locally, in some cases nationally, or even globally. But as he moves out, he tends to do what he always does. He bounces around looking for a place to live, finally settles on a place. He does rent an office space separate from the household so he can work there and not interfere with his family life and frankly, his pretty significant social life. He probably had more of a social life, and that unfortunately also meant more alcohol when he was in Hawaii than he was in California. Ralph Rothman, who was the secretary and general manager of ERB Incorporated, is actually running day-to-day business, and Burroughs does most of his communications on business with him. His oldest, Joanne, and his youngest, Jack, are both married. Joanne's got children, or one child, another one on the way. Holly Hulbert Burroughs is single. When he gets to Hawaii, obviously he needs money. Ralph Rothman had discussed with the editor of Amazing Stories about Burroughs writing a series of novelettes that could be tied together to a point they could be put together. Eventually decided four novelettes make up a novel, which could then be published either, by Burroughs Incorporated as first editions. Burroughs had tried the novelette approach just a year or so before with what he was calling the New Tarzan series, which were going to have Tarzan as a jungle detective, solving murders or finding stolen property and that kind of thing. That, I think, one story really came out of that. And he dropped it. But Ralph Rothman had thought this might be a good business model. And so as you can see here, Burroughs, in his office, literally started cranking out novelettes in each of his series. And what's interesting is, as you'll see, from the Tarzan, Mars, Pellucidar, and Venus series, he literally just did one novelette, went to another series, and this just went on, and he cranked this out. What this means is he wrote 3 or 4 books in just about a year or so. And some of these are actual novels he had finished. You can see some important things that happened in his life. The big one is, of course, in World War II with the U.S. entry. He actually, with his son Hulley, saw the attack on Pearl Harbor. Didn't realize it was the attack on Pearl Harbor. Thought it was exercises until later in the day. He eventually becomes a war correspondent, and you can see where he interrupted his writing a fair amount. Why did his writing fall off after 1944, 45, 46? Overexertion. He had a series of health problems throughout his adult life, all of which got worse when he was older, most notably heart problems. And exertions when running up and down ladders on Navy ships and other exertions eventually paid the price. And it really did basically damage him for life in about 1946 to his death in 1950. Burroughs, as you probably know, was a very self-disciplined writer. He would sit down, he had a routine, and he'd write. And he would put the words on the page, or in some cases the words into the dictaphone or ediphone. And he actually had a dictaphone shipped out in September of 1940. He continued writing some of his stories through dictaphones off of outlines. He was still unhappy about the fact he was not getting to the slicks. He was unhappy that his name was maybe selling more than the quality of his work. He tried a couple of stories, or actually more than a couple of stories, and some nonfiction under pseudonyms. As far as I know, nothing that was under a pseudonym sold. He eventually had to sell it back offered back out with his name on it. He did actually try some movie treatments before the start of the war, just before the start of the war, from various novels. Had even suggested that a couple of his World War I stories, notably the Beyond 30, which talked about World War I being an unending war, updating it about what was happening in Europe, about potential unending war in Europe. Didn't sell, but he tried. And a couple of Tarzan novels he offered up, besides more like the novels and less like the Weissmuller movies. And again, as you can see, his celebrity continues. They interviewed him. They actually had him on the radio, I think, the night after he arrived in Hawaii. He had promised, by the way, a John Carter radio show, I think, during that interview. And he would be on the radio many, many times during the war, including when he was out deployed as a correspondent, because he was a celebrity. Quick summary of what happened with World War II. Again, he and his son, Hully, saw the attack in Pearl Harbor. They actually volunteered for guard duty that night. Helped with some escorting of Japanese Americans. The Army, and because of where he lived, he got to know, and because of his social activities every night, he got to know a lot of military personnel and other important personnel in Hawaii. So in some cases, he could walk in on these people and talk to them, either at the hotel where some of them stayed, or just felt comfortable by it because he knew them, actually meeting them somewhere else. The executive officer for the commanding general of the Army organization in Hawaii actually suggested he write a column that would be on the lighter side to help, bolster morale. And that was, he called it "Laugh It Off," and it did appear in two of the major papers in Hawaii for several weeks before he decided to call it off. He got himself involved in the Business Military Training Corps, which was just as it sounds, a bunch of older white businessmen who decided they wanted to make up a self-defense or defense force for the islands. And they had their own rank structure, looked like the Army, and they wore uniforms. Burroughs started as a public relations officer. He was a drill instructor for recruits. He'd resigned a couple of times. He just wanted to do more than what they were letting him do, or BMTC wasn't taking him seriously enough. He got talked back a couple of times. He wanted to be a liaison officer with the Army. And he really was. He was an all-in kind of guy. He promised, as you may recall, the patriotic fervor got him in trouble with the Germans because his fiction at the time pretty much treated Germans with a certain amount of hatred. Unfortunately, his patriotic fervor in World War II in the beginning years got him really thinking bad thoughts about Japanese and even Americans of Japanese descent. He changed his mind as it wore on, and took back pretty much everything he said about the trustworthiness of Japanese Americans, and actually flipped it the other way around and said no one should ever question the loyalty of Japanese Americans or even their families. So, but he was a very opinionated fellow, and he wrote quite a number of articles on his view of life during these war years. He got what he really wanted. He got accredited as a United Press war correspondent. He wound up being the oldest war correspondent, Pacific Theater, to the age of 67. And he did three tours, two with the Army and the final one with the Navy. He started a set of war diaries for his deployments, and he actually started an autograph book. He said, everybody keeps asking for an autograph, I'm going to start asking others. And 600-700 autographs in those books. He actually used those to help crosswalk soldiers and sailors and Marines with his articles and with his diaries. Again, Laugh It Off column, pretty much the first thing he did in something that looked like an official capacity. There's the hotel he stayed at, 30 bungalows with a central dining facility, just right for playing cards, which he loved, and alcohol. BMTC patch, and there's Burroughs in his tin pot, third from the left, with some BMTC officers, including the commander and a couple of Army officers. All right, his first tour, he actually worked with Frank Tremaine, United Press head in Hawaii, and George Carlin, head of United Feature Syndicate, who, as you know, was a syndicate for the Tarzan strip. to get his accreditation. Got it on the 2nd of November 1942. They waited for the Army to approve and assign him a plane. Correspondents were supposed to be given the privileges of officers, and that meant they were supposed to be able to fly. And they actually flew him out to Canton Island. He spent time in New Caledonia. Flew to Sydney, Australia, spent a New Year in Sydney. Did quite a few radio interviews, radio shows, and print interviews. Flew back to New Caledonia and then was sent back to Hawaii and to Pearl Harbor by sea ship. Basically, he got a little tired. He was unhappy with what the Navy did. The Navy would not recognize his Army credentials and would not support him flying. So they put him on a ship, and he actually went back by surface. And you get just a vague idea. I did put some more circles on this about where he was. 8,000 miles of flying. Here's what he came back in, the destroyer USS Shaw, which ultimately had 11 battle stars in World War II. You'll notice on the bottom photo, it ran aground on a reef before that would cause them to go back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. And you can see that some of the patch job, the commander of the ship actually told Burroughs, he said, we drop a depth charge or a couple other things we tried, we might actually sink. So interesting to put Burroughs on that ship. He did take his war diary, wrote up an article, a 60-page paper called The Diary of a Confused Old Man, or Buck Burroughs Rides Again. You can actually find this online. Interesting reading. Lots of alcohol. Lots of alcohol. I don't care where he was in the war zone. They found alcohol to drink. Interesting. Second tour. Took him a while to get accreditation back, or get another assignment, I should say. This time, a friend of his that he had made the commander of the 7th Bomber Command, a one-star general in Hawaii, got him out and on a flight. And you see there went to Tarawa and the Gabriel Islands, and then to Eniwetok, famous later for where he did some nuclear bomb tests. He visits by small boat a number of atolls and islands. He actually sees his son Hully, who at that time, by the way, Hully enlisted in the Army Air Forces not long after the war started with the Army, with the U.S. entry. Eventually went from private, got a commission because he had been an RTC cadet at one time, and eventually when he leaves the Army, he's a major. He's a combat photographer, does a lot of photography in bomber runs and that kind of thing. So they actually get to visit, as you see here, on Kwajalein Island. Flies back on a hospital ship, a hospital airplane on the 24th of April, 7,000 miles of air flight. Not long after he gets back, his first wife passes away. He and Holly actually fly to California. I mentioned the fact that Burroughs had health issues. He had bladder issues, he had heart issues. In this case, he had a hernia operation when he was in California and spent a month convalescing. Unfortunately, in these years, it seems that if he goes to the hospital, he'll eventually wind up convalescing for a month, sometimes in the hospital itself. So going out on these deployments probably did not help. His third tours with the Navy. It's interesting, when he was those 3 months he was in California, he actually started thinking about a third marriage, which certainly did not make the children happy. He goes back to Hawaii. I think he's probably thinking about coming back. But what stops all that is the Navy accredits him as a correspondent. And they put him on the USS Cahaba, which is a fleet oiler, which does a monumental number of missions in the 2 years it's out in the Pacific Theater on refueling aircraft carriers, destroyers, battleships, and cruisers. And that's what he writes about. He writes about life on what this ship does. By the way, when he was on the Shaw, he wrote 25 articles for the United Press. Almost none of them got published. He thinks that they were sent direct to the War Department in D.C. and never saw the light of day. A few got published. What he wrote here, sometimes I had to wait till he got home, but many of those got published in several newspapers. So he does his tour out in the water. He's then sent back home, and he flies back this time. Tyrone Power, interesting enough, was a pilot on the first leg to go on. So again, as you can see, he really racked up some miles and took his typewriter everywhere, wrote, kept his diaries up, got his hourglass books. Again, Burroughs was, if nothing else, could really be a machine when it came to these things. His laugh it off column, he was suggested on day one to write it. He had the first one written the next day. So when you see Burroughs in war correspondence uniforms, look very closely on his insignia to see if it's an Army correspondent insignia or a Navy. You can see the Navy anchors on this one. All right, as you saw, in between those deployments and other personal issues, he did write, 40 and 41 being really the peak of his output. So Lana Goethal, it really is the last true Mars novel, although it is 4 novelettes. And what you see here is a great J. Allen St. John. Did the covers for all 4 of these. And really very, if you're going to end your fiction output, it's great to have J. Allen St. John, who was at one time his favorite artist, doing the work. That cover for Lana Goethal is by his son. John Coleman Burroughs did all the covers and interiors for all books published by ERB Incorporated. Escape on Venus, these 4 novelettes also, his covers all by J. Allen St. John. And John Coleman Burroughs, of course, did this cover as well. The last Mars stories, and I'm going to talk more about the unfinished storylines and stories of Burroughs at a short presentation tomorrow. But as you can see, really his last John Carter story was the Skeleton Men of Jupiter. Certainly he had planned to write more in this series, but just didn't get to it. There's a controversy for many years if John Carter Mars later, if the magazine called John Carter and Vagina Mars was actually written by ERB. It was actually written by his son, Jack Burroughs. Started out as a big little book and was expanded a bit. His wife actually helped write it, Jane Ralston Burroughs, and that's why it was much of a controversy. If you read it, of course, you'll see it just seems to lack that Burroughs touch. But they were published together and are still published together since then. And that's the first edition in 1964 by Canaveral Press with beautiful pen and ink by Reed Crandall. All right, very quick, Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated was still publishing. The paper shortage really put a crimp in publishing. They normally would do a spring and a fall book. It was a time when Burroughs would write one Tarzan and one of something else so they could keep the output going. Burroughs Incorporated did do a pretty significant reprint run in 1948. Now there are two kinds of wartime editions that were obviously printed on cheap because of the paper shortage and trying to keep costs down. One is the Grosset and Dunlap Madison Square editions, and if you're ever on, especially the early days of eBay, people would claim these are first editions all the time, and they're just most acidic paper you can get. So it's sad when people bought those, thinking they were getting something better. And then the 11 editions, by the way, and they're all Tarzan novels in the Madison Squares. 2 Tarzan novels were done in the Armed Service editions, those little pocket books. Millions and millions of copies published for soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. Only one record album was done. This is put out by Decca in 1947 by the Tarzan Players. It just happens that even though there was talk about maybe more Tarzan radio shows, and there was a claim they were broadcasting something in Hawaii in the early 1940s. I had to check on what really that's about. But Burroughs had mentioned a John Carter radio show. I don't know much more about it than the fact he apparently mentioned it. Sorry, no good pictures. A number of big little books were still coming out in those war years. Interesting, these are all that John Coleman Burroughs touched, either because he did covers or other components of the book. And of course, John Carter Morris he also wrote. And he did some other big little book work besides these. Oh, I thought I deleted that. All right, Tarzan movies. Hard to believe that from 1939 to 1950, 11 Tarzan movies came out. We won't go into too much detail, but as you know, Jane, in fact, they were thinking seriously about killing off Jane when, and I've just forgotten the name of the actress. There's your trivia question. Marina Sullivan, thank you. I won my, where'd that book go? When Marina Sullivan decided she didn't want to play Jane anymore, they ran a few movies without a Jane at all. Decided to actually bring the character back and had bounced around. Brenda Joyce played Jane to the remainder of those movies with Johnny Weissmuller. She was the carryover when Lex Barker became Tarzan. And then they started doing a new Jane in every single Lex Barker movie. It also happens that in 1941, the 15-chapter serial Jungle Girl came out, starred Frances Gifford, who, as you notice, was played Zandra in Tarzan Triumphs. By the way, which movie did Tarzan say, "Now Tarzan make war"? Is that right? Everybody agree with that? All right, this thing blew up. On the lower left is Saul Lesser, who actually did a Tarzan movie with Buster Crabbe back in the 1930s, but he wound up doing the post-MGM Tarzan movies with Johnny Weissmuller, and then afterward, until Saul Weintraub took over. On the right, this is, some people say this is the last public appearance that Burroughs made before his death, when he visited the set of Tarzan the Slave Girl. On the left is Jane Ralston Burroughs, Jack Burroughs' wife. Just standing above Ed is his oldest, Joanne Burroughs Pierce, and of course that's Lex Barker. All right, it's interesting that John Coleman Burroughs, again, he turned 30 in the early war years. Two children born during the war years. Wound up actually being pretty busy despite everything else he was doing on artwork. So there was a plan originally for Dell Comics to do a 32-page David Innes, a police story. Dell decided they didn't really want to do this kind of protagonist anymore in their books, so they dumped it. First 12 pages came out of a little-known book called High Spot Comics. The rest of it never appeared. Thanks to Burroughs fans, of course, all the artwork is showing up, and it's also in the Edgar Rice Burroughs Library of Illustration, if you ever want to look at it. Jack Burroughs and his wife Jane would be their own models for a lot of the work that Jack did, and here he is modeling, I believe, as David, or in this case, Dave. It's got to be Dave in this. He also wound up doing quite a few of the John Carter comic book stories, all of which appeared in the funnies. The first 3 stories were done by another artist, and then he took over with number 34, and John Carter of Mars story appeared in every issue until 56. So actually pretty interesting run. These are unfortunately hard to find comic books. Sometimes John Carter is on the cover, and often he's not. It's because, as you can see, they had a number of characters in each one of these. Now, the interesting thing is that back in 1932, Burroughs actually approached the United Future Syndicate about doing a John Carter Sunday strip, which is, as you recall, the daily was only started in 1929. The United Future was worried about diluting Tarzan and taking away readers, so it was shelved. There was also, as you recall, an attempt to actually go with the John Carter full-length movie, animated, with the great Bob Clampett and Jack Burroughs working with him. That never happened. There's a little bit of footage that still you can find on that. But when they decided to stop the stories and the funnies, it just happens that John Carter Mars did appear as a Sunday-only strip. As you see, unfortunately, the first day it came out was the 7th of December, 1941. It's a bad day. Not only are paper shortages going to hit like in a matter of days, but they started rationing colored inks too. So only 4 papers in the States featured it. A lot of those had to go to monochromes, so you might see orange, burnt orange, or red, or some other color in black. So you wouldn't even find full color pages, all because of the war. And it eventually ran out right in the middle of the story. There were 4 unpublished pages, which also again showed up in the Edgar Rice Burroughs Library of Illustration and by Burroughs Bibliophiles Publications. Again, you see his wife Jane Ralston playing Deja Thoris, posing for that. Jack Burroughs also made an articulated model of a thoat, the riding animal that Redmond and Greenman used. And there's his son and Burroughs' grandson, Dan Burroughs, with the sword that was made, was used. And if you ever take a good look at the strips, you see it looks exactly like this sword. He used it to model that. Dell Comics, they finally decided to do original stories. Dell Comics picked him up in 1947, and he would appear in Dell 4-color for several years until he got his own title. Jesse Marsh got the assignment and drew Tarzan for many, many years until Russ Manning took over in the early 60s. What's interesting, if you look on the right, one of the artists that tried out for this was John Coleman Burroughs. And he pretty much did the whole story. And I've seen a couple of the pages, and I think they're better than Jesse Marsh. And I've seen some other pages that are definitely not as good as Jesse Marsh, because he was clearly racing the finish, which is probably why he didn't get selected. Tarzan Sunday strip, Bern Hogarth had been doing the strip, the Sunday page, for quite a time. As you see on the left-hand side, there's an example. Tarzan often was the first strip. You could be up to 32 pages, as you know, into a Sunday supplement section. Tarzan was often the feature on the front. When Hogarth decided to go off and do his own strip, they brought in Ruben Moria. I know I'm mispronouncing his name. Otherwise, Ruben Moore, pen name. I actually thought he was pretty good, but when Hogarth's strip failed and he came back, they gladly dumped Ruben Moore and brought Hogarth back. And then Bob Lewis took over in 1950 when Hogarth moved on to concentrate on his art school. But before those original stories came out, for many, many years, dailies and Sundays were reprinted in some way or form in various comic books, either as one-shots or as part of compilations over the years. And there's just an example. Those first 2 on the upper left are one-shots. But he appeared in many Tip-Top comics. Sometimes he was on the cover, sometimes he was one of number, like you see here on the upper right. Sparkler, same thing. Sometimes he was on the cover, sometimes not. Jeep Comics, something that was put together for soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. And there even were text inserts in something called Crackerjack Comics by Dell, which were attributed to Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I sincerely doubt he wrote. All right, to help start closing out, it is interesting that Edgar Rice Burroughs shows up as a semi-fictional character based on his World War II years. One of them, the first one was Don't Go Near the Water by William Hinckley. I didn't put his name up there, apologize. This is a satirical take on U.S. Navy public relations people, although I gather he's satirized pretty much everybody. It's episodic. Every chapter is kind of a new story. It happens that Burroughs is kind of the driver of one of those chapters. And the other one was the Pearl Harbor murders. Mystery writer Max Allen Collins, who, as some of you know, penned Dick Tracy strip and has written many other things over the years. Had a series called the Disaster Mystery Series, and this is the third in the series. Edgar Rice Burroughs, OB, Old Burroughs, and his son Holly On the day of the Pearl Harbor attack, they actually solved some murders. So I think this is the only one of those books that actually came out in a hardcover out of a book club. Burroughs has popped up more often since then as a fictional character, but these two relate to the war and were the first ones that I'm aware of. All right, I got some extra time, so you can ask questions I can't answer. All right, you can see he showed up in Amazing Stories, Thrilling Adventures, Tarzan and the Jungle Murders. Remember that one new Tarzan series was in Thrilling Adventures. And there was even an Argosy, The Quest of Tarzan. First cover, of all people, Virgil Finlay did. Yes?
When I discovered a copy of the Jungle Girl serial on VHS tape in the 80s, I brought it over to show to my dad because Frances Gifford was his high school and college girlfriend. She later married the much more famous actor James Dunn, but she always claimed that my dad was the closest thing to Tarzan he'd ever seen, and he was a top-ranked officer and a boxing champion in the U.S. Navy. Pearl Harbor Survivors Association president, so he's a manly man. And when I showed him Frances Gifford swinging through the trees, he said, "Oh, look at those beautiful legs. Don't I have good taste?" And I said, "Dad, that's Dave Sharp stunting for Frances Gifford." And he said, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Oh my God, I'm admiring a man's legs." It was so funny. But, he didn't realize that Jungle Girl was a Burroughs character. And when I told him, he said, "You mean the guy who did Tarzan?" And so it just goes to show that it's a small world.
All right. I will tell you that I'm not sure the Jungle Girl serial was really very close to the plot of the original novel.
No, it wasn't.
Yes, sir.
Can you tell us more about the war correspondent work he did? Were these articles substantial articles about the military? Were they like travel logs, something like what Attorney Kyle is doing in Europe? Or how do they stack up today?
I got to set them up in a book up in my room, and I haven't looked at them in so long. I get a little worried about telling you. I will tell you that in many cases he did concentrate on the people, but he talked about units as well. But I'm going to have to look. You might want to grab me tomorrow or the next day. I'll give you a better answer. I will tell you that the ones he wrote from the Fleet Oiler were about how what the boat did and what the ship did, and what the sailors did and what those operations looked like. But I just have to read more about them before I can get back to you. He wrote a lot of things not as a war correspondent. I mentioned the stuff he would write about on just the Japanese-American question and other things about how people should be working harder for the war effort, or many, many other things about administration and all. Burroughs was a strongly opinionated person. But please get back with me. Yes, sir?
I was wondering, on a military edition, were those edited books? What would the word count be on one of those formats? Were the
Armed Service Edition?
Yeah, the Armed Service Editions, were they abridged versions of the books? And how much would the word count be about?
I've got some collectors in this room. I've been led to believe that the wartime editions were not abridged.
That's what I've always heard. I believe that's I've heard the same.
And remember, they published 400, 500, 600 titles.
Well, more than what you said.
It's embarrassing because I bought the book about the books, and I haven't read it yet. And I actually pulled down and posted the entire list onto a Word file for this, and it ran 60 pages. So, and again, I forget how many millions and millions of books were printed. The gentleman right there first in the back.
I was struck by your slide that showed the staggered writing schedule of the various novels. Were they published in that same staggered manner?
I was actually going to try to figure out the reason I started finishing this briefing, this presentation this morning, because for 3 months I was trying to figure out how to show you written to magazine to book, because a number of, by the way, remember I told you about his rejections? Some of these books, including a couple of Tarzan novels, were never accepted for magazine publication. Their first appearance was actually in hardcover. Tarzan the Foreign Legion never appeared in the magazine. And so some of these literally went straight to hardcover. In some cases, In a few cases, they didn't appear until the 60s. Savage Pellucidar was the fourth. You can see it, where's 1944? Out in 1944, you can see where he wrote the fourth novelette for that series. Those appeared, none of them with the cover, by the way, which is why you didn't see them. None were featured on the cover. And then that one appeared and was published a fair amount later. So if you someday if you send me an email, I will continue trying to get this done anyway, because it's interesting to see how these things progress, because they did in fact did run in different issues, but it looked like so as you see the Mars were 1941. Notice how they're staggered with the Escape on Venus. The Escape on Venus novels are also in the 41 and 42, but they're in different magazines. The Skeleton Men of Jupiter was February of 1943, and amazing. So it's a great question. I can only partially answer that. Yes, sir.
Was Kennicott still at Blue Book in these days?
He was.
Did he mess with Burroughs' text the way Ray Palmer did?
I can tell you that, and I got folks in the corporation here, so they're gonna be able to tell me the right answer. Tarzan the Jungle Murders, I've been told, got edited pretty hard. There were a couple of times when editors told Burroughs, they said, these just ain't cutting it. If you don't mind, we're going to put an editor on it and rewrite it, or substantially edit it. So I can go back and track and tell you which ones. In fact, we've had a conversation about whether the original Murder in the Jungle can even be found. It was shopped so many places that I'm not sure the typescript survived. And he was very unhappy about the way the last novelettes in the Pellucidar series were rewritten. So I think all of those were edited. And I think even John Carpenter's Giant of Mars may have been touched, although it wasn't his. And I know there's some other works of his that were touched this period. Let's not kid ourselves. Some of those Burroughs stories, and they got the Burroughs flavor, right? Even in, maybe it's because I'm a Burroughs fan, even some of his stories that aren't the most imaginative or original, they have that Burroughs flair and that Burroughs style, and they still read. But there's no doubt a lot of his are travelogues, where you get to meet many more new kinds of races of odd beings. There's someone back there before I called Huck. Ed, the guys are going to stump me. Go ahead.
Henry, do you mind if I add some info about Jungle Girl? Contrary to popular opinion, it actually has nothing to do with the Burroughs novel Jungle Girl, which was serialized in Blue Book as The Land of Hidden Men before Burroughs published it under his own imprint as Jungle Girl. What happened was Republic Pictures came up with the character of Nyoka, Jungle Girl, who does not appear in the novel. The novel takes place actually in the jungles of Cambodia, whereas Jungle Girl takes place in Africa. Republic basically just paid Burroughs $7,500 for the rights to use the title Jungle Girl and his name, which they felt would give a big publicity boost to what was essentially a completely original story.
Right. You can see his name if you're close enough on the poster. And I was being sarcastic when I said it didn't link closely with the plot of the book. Not that it's ever happened in Hollywood since then. Thank goodness. One time. Huck.
Oh, I was just going to mention that the first three novelettes that became Savage Pellucidar were published during the war. The last one did not come out until 1963.
I decided not to put that in here because none of the covers were his, but I almost included the Savage Pellucidar because it's a science fiction magazine with, no kidding, science fiction, Moonlander on the cover, and there's Savage Pellucidar on the bottom in 1963. And then, of course, just a matter of months, Canaveral Press puts out Savage Pellucidar as a hardcover with all 4 stories in it.
You mentioned at one point his increasing rejections in the early
The answer is yes. And even in the 20s and 30s, some of these editors knew how much the Burroughs name meant, even if it wasn't a Tarzan story.
Was that being driven largely by the Tarzan movies?
I can tell you that for pulp readers, the original print really made the difference. Readers like what they're reading. More readers, of course, got in because of the movies and the newspapers. In fact, Burroughs himself acknowledged that the newspaper strip actually helped bolster people buying books. Although later, there's always a question about where did people stop spending their dollar. So there's a reason why Burroughs did not want to see the character diluted in the movies or the strips. He hated it when people kept having Tarzan laugh in the movies. He said, "That's not Tarzan. You're ruining the character. You're actually damaging my property. That's not what people think of Tarzan when they read my books or or see them in the pulps." So Burroughs was always worried about how much the character survived interpretation. Although, as anyone else in Hollywood knows, the producers try very hard to be exactly what the writer envisions because, the writer comes first. And certainly he lost control of Tarzan like maybe the first movie. Yes, sir.
Where did Madison Square come from?
I got collectors in the room, thank goodness. I do not know where, because that was a G&D imprint. And so I don't, Mike Conrad, help me.
During the war, right?
That's as far as I know, and they did other titles besides Burroughs, of course, because they were reprinting almost. They were what, probably the biggest reprint, what they called the popular copyright in the country.
I've got a couple of Zane Grays in Madison Square.
But luckily, those don't have acidic paper.
Oh yes, they do.
I'm joking.
I got my first Madison Square. They were less than 10 years old, and they were already down in Burroughs.
Yes, sir.
I just want to add, I believe the Madison Square thing was just an attempt to create a branded name like Washington Square Press, just to give it a little panache. I don't think it worked.
It may have also been an excuse for a little lower quality without completely damaging the G&D name, but again, paper shortages and all that. I am like 30 seconds out from being done, so I think I'm done.
You've been listening to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the PulpNet, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines for over 25 years. Please visit us online at thepulp.net. Also, look for the PulpNet on Facebook and on Twitter. Thank you for listening, and keep reading the pulps. The Pulp Event podcast is copyright 2021.